Thank you very much. I'm actually going to hand over to Darren Panney, my co-author for this presentation.
Thanks, Sam, and afternoon, everybody, or morning here in Australia. Pleasure to be with you. Hope I'm coming through loud and clear. I heard one of the earlier speakers talk about a bit of technophobia, so these sort of things done remotely always spark a little bit of technophobia, so I hope you can hear us all well. We're investigating panel conditioning effects on the Life in Australia panel. Not progressing from, there we go. I think everybody's had that nervous moment, so thank you. So myself, Darren Panney, I'm the founder in a previous life of the Social Research Centre, a Melbourne-based survey research and evaluation company. I'm retired from that role, and nowadays I'm an honorary professor in the practice of survey methodology at the ANU Centre for Social Research and Methods. Co-presenter today is Sam, very bright young statistician with the Social Research Centre, and a collaborator on this is Paul Avrakis, who I'm sure needs no real introduction to the American audience here today. He's had a very distinguished career and made many great contributions to APOR, for which he's been recognised. He's less well known for the fact that since 2010, when I met Paul at APOR, that he's made a significant contribution to survey research in Australia also. I'd like to thank the Social Research Centre. Particularly like to thank the Scanlon Foundation, whose data we're using today, and also the Life in Australia panellists. So our topic is, does participating in a research panel affect the reported attitudes and opinions, or really actual and reported attitudes and opinions of panellists over time? So just by way of a refresher for everyone, really, what I've got here is the optimal question response model. The data set that we're using, which I'll explain in a moment, is the Social Cohesion Survey, was first run on the Life in Australia panel on wave 18 of the panel. So our panellists' first exposure to these group of about 40 attitudinal questions was in wave 18. The optimal response cycle that we wanted our panellists to go through was one of taking the time to read and comprehend the question, to retrieve or formulate their answer, to make a judgment about whether they wanted to provide that answer. That's where things like social desirability may have come into play, and then to map their answer to the response set that we provided. So what happens when you ask this question repeatedly over time? Well, the reflection and cognitive stimulus model gives us some clues as to what might happen. They talk about, so in the next wave, they were asked these questions, wave 29. So comprehension, retrieval, judgment, response, and this new element, reflection. So the thinking is that having been asked that question, these series of questions once before, panellists may reflect on their previous answer. They may discuss their previous answer with someone. They may be more alert to media coverage or whatever, but have this topic of interest, and so could possibly change your answer. Then they're asked again in wave 40, wave 44, wave 51. So what's the cumulative effect of this repeated exposure to similar questions over time? So the cognitive stimulus model suggests a couple of effects that we're able to measure with our data. They are that attitudes become more reliable, i.e. better measures of the underlying constructs that they're attempting to measure, and attitudes become more stable, so more highly correlated, less variable over time. With respect to social desirability, the literature is a little equivocal with respect to panel conditioning. The expectation is that with each successive wave of data collection, panellists develop trust in the survey organisation, the survey procedure, trust, they become familiar with the nature of the questions they're being asked, and that this trust should in turn increased their willingness to disclose unflattering information. Most of the literature that we were able to source for this study, however, is based on large-scale, high-effort, interview-administered annual longitudinal survey programs. Relatively little is based on probability-based online panels where panelists are surveyed much more frequently and cumulative response rates are much lower. So we're interested to see whether that literature applied in the case of probability surveys, probability panels. As briefly mentioned before, our data comes from 5 consecutive waves of the Scanlon Foundation's Social Cohesion Survey, spanning July 2018 through to July 2021. And we have 1,333 panelists that are available for us. So, and these panelists responded to all 5 waves. So that means that we don't have differential non-response due to attrition to have to worry about. So what we're going to look at and quickly present is whether there is evidence that attitudes reported by Life in Australia panelists over this time in response to these questions becomes more reliable, becomes more stable, and are we able to detect a reduction in social desirability bias? Arguably, if each of these things are true, this could be an indicator of beneficial panel conditioning insofar as the data that is being collected is more accurate or a true reflection of the underlying attitudes and opinions of panelists. So I'll hand over to Sam. I'll keep control of the slide deck to talk about our findings with respect to reliability. So thanks, Sam.
Great, thanks, Darren. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly talk through the first two of those 3 research questions with some preliminary results that we've gathered. So firstly, on reliability, the items that we're using for this analysis are 10 questions that are asked over all 5 waves that we have available to us. These 10 questions are grouped into 5 pairs, each relating to an underlying factor from 5 social cohesion domains, which are a large focus of the Social Cohesion Survey. The 5 are participation, acceptance, rejection, belonging, social justice, and worth. The measure of reliability is the mean of the communalities for each of these groupings of items using a confirmatory factor model, each with 1 underlying factor. This being so we're essentially measuring the average percentage variance of items, which is explained by that underlying factor. So this approach follows Sturgis et al.'s study. I think we had a reference a couple of slides ago. This chart here shows those 5 social cohesion domains and the reliability on each wave. The waves across the horizontal axis and reliability measure across the vertical axis. And for the 5 social cohesion domains, we estimate a general increase in reliability for 4 of those 5 domains, which are shown in the blue fill as opposed to the orange. So that suggests a general increase in reliability over those measurement of those 5 social cohesion domains over our 5 waves of the survey. So now in stability, we measure stability using we have 2 ways of measuring stability. We can look at the scales from those confirmatory factor models in the previous analysis. And then we also look at 28 individual attitudinal items, which we identify as susceptible to the cognitive stimulus hypothesis. And our measure is Pearson's or Spearman's correlation coefficient, depending on whether the attitudinal items are nominal or ordinal. And we calculate for each item or factor scale between adjacent waves over all of our individuals who responded to all 5 waves of our survey. And we do that for 4 adjacent wave pairs. So looking at the 5 factors here, we again see a general increase over the 5 waves. Again, just being careful to see that along the horizontal axis, we have wave comparisons rather than waves themselves. So first we compare July 2018 to July 2019, and then so on. The caveat of this analysis is that we don't actually have evenly distributed waves over time. This means we can't untangle the potential for different wave timings to be a cause of stability change rather than panel conditioning itself. What we'd like to do in future is incorporate more data over different waves of the survey, because this survey has continued on for another wave beyond our analysis, and potentially restructure our data to instead looking at panelists' first, second, third response, so on, rather than yearly responses. And in the next slide, Darren, I'm again showing a similar chart, but instead for 28 attitudinal items. And although that graph on the left is a bit of a mess, the story here is that we're seeing blue rather than orange. So we have evidence of a general increase in stability again. And on the right, I've just got a table of positive and negative gradients. 24 of the 28 attitudinal items appear to have a generally positive gradient in stability, with 4 negative. And then down below that, just a small bar chart showing average item-wise correlation between waves of the four wave comparisons that we've done. And we see again a general increase there. And I'll hand back to Darren to talk about social desirability change.
Thanks, Sam. Okay, so we use 13 items deemed to be likely to be affected by social desirability bias. 8 of these items related to attitudes to immigration, to the equity distribution of wealth issues, and 3 to discrimination. Now, this is from the whole data set, which contained about 40 attitudinal items. All the questions are appended at the back of this slide deck. We won't go through them today, but they have strong face validity for being items prone to social desirability bias. And there is also some external validity for the selection of these items, insofar as when the Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion Survey used to be done as a dual frame RDD caddy survey, when it transitioned to the Life in Australia panel, 2 waves were run in parallel, both on caddy and on the panel. And for all those items, we saw a decrease in the amount, a change in the response pattern consistent with a decrease in social desirability when they moved from caddy RDD to Life in Australia. So the 2 measures we're using to determine whether there's been any panel conditioning impacts, or to try and understand whether there's been any panel conditioning impacts that might affect social desirability of reporting, is to compare responses to the same items in 2018 and 2021, same 13 items, and identify the proportion of panellists whose response patterns showed either a net increase or net decrease, or no change in social desirability reporting, and also a change in magnitude, the average number of items that a panellist might have moved in either direction. So this first chart here, just a cautionary note that the most socially desirable response is the lowest response. So most of these scales were operationalised as sort of 1, strongly agree, and the strongly agree was generally the most socially desirability response. We inverted the scales where we needed to for this. Shows that generally this decline shows.
Excuse me, you have 2 minutes.
Thank you. An increase in social desirability reporting over time. And this slide shows that on average, 53% of our panellists showed an increase in social desirability, 15% no change, and 32% of decline in social desirability reporting. The average number of variables each panellist moved between 2018 and 2021, the average was 2.7%, sorry, 2.7 items. So the net change was 2.7 items in a socially desirable fashion, and 1.8 items in a non-socially desirable direction. There were subgroup differences. Those that did not complete secondary school moved on average 3.1 items in a socially desirable direction compared to those with postgraduate qualifications, and moved 2.4 items. The biggest driver of that, something you haven't seen reported before, was their starting point. So if you did not complete secondary school, your starting point was from a far less socially desirable position, therefore you had more scope to move. So I'll just quickly sum up. We did find evidence of increased stability and reliability. We found, contrary to the literature, a very slight increase in social desirability, but nothing to suggest the attitudes being measured with these questions are substantially different in 2021 than 2018. And our cut through from all of this was the considerable advantages of using probably based online panels as platforms for social science surveys are not diminished by these findings. And we have a lot more work to do in this area. So thank you very much, and I hope I've finished on time.